So the deep state is the critical nut we have to crack to understand what's going on in the world today. And I said that the deep state was like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And they were codependent, the peanut butter and the jelly. Peanut butter being the political economic infrastructure that was created to function a world federal system. And why is that? Well, this is where we need to get to the jelly. And I'm going to get into this by way of the scholarship surrounding the concept of Western esotericism. And I'm going to begin something like this. This is a huge concept, obviously, and I'm going to break it down in simple parts. And some of this is just going to be some names I'm throwing at you. I'm going to dig and develop these throughout, but they're going to give us insight into what's happening and the events that are unfolding, a significant insight. And what I think I'm doing here that's special is I'm doing all of this within the parameters of scholarship. And I have set this up one base at a time so that anybody can investigate any of the legs to get where we're at right now. So Western esotericism has its foundations in what are referred to as the ancient mysteries or the mystery schools. And I know for some people, this, you just lose some people right there, but so be it. This is usually referred to as angelic knowledge or fallen angel knowledge, depending upon your perspective. And it really begins best with Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes Trismegistus. And he sort of embodies as a great magi all of the information from the mystery schools. And I think it's easy to see him as a contemporary of the biblical Moses. And this is where it's important, because this tradition that we're about to discuss builds upon itself in a conscious opposition to a biblical narrative. And we can go into that narrative a little bit down the road. But for now, we have Hermetic knowledge is the foundation of everything. We get the modern word Hermeticism from that term. And from this, and almost contemporary with it, we get the idea of gnosis, Gnosticism. And this is an idea of understanding and apprehending and changing the world through knowledge. It may have its foundation in the sort of garden and the bite of the forbidden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's probably the best way, by analogy, to think of Gnosticism. It's a left-hand path. There's going to be another tradition that suggests that heaven and earth were separated through the consumption of the knowledge of good and evil, and that there's an attempt for God and man to be reconciled. But it's not through man's knowledge, but through his obedience to a plan made through a God who revealed himself and his plan. So that's one direction. And Gnosticism and Hermeticism are oftentimes referred to as the left-hand path. In that path, that there was sort of a vindictive God that was holding people down, and that the tree of good, the knowledge of good and evil, was a path for man to take his own direction and assert himself into the affairs of the world through his knowledge. He was no longer going to be held down. And we could sort of think of, the lightning bolt coming down to man and man grasping it and consciously being involved in his own future. So we have Hermeticism and Gnosticism. From this, again, a lot of these are building upon one another and contemporaries of one another, but we can sort of include at this point Kabbalism, a loaded term that we'll discuss in a minute. And these are all part of the mixture of the ancient world. I think they had a great deal to do with things that we don't even associate with them, like Greek knowledge, especially Pythagorean knowledge or Pythagorean numerology. And many of the ideas that Plato and Aristotle discuss, but especially Plato, are loaded with Hermetic Kabbalistic concepts. And we'll dig into those a little bit as time comes. So that's the ancient world. And we have kind of a mixture of those ideas going around in the ancient world. And they're going to be resurrected to some extent in the late medieval and the Renaissance world of Europe. And they're going to be repackaged in the form of humanism. And this is really the foundation for the rebirth of the West. There was sort of what we think of as more of a medieval or Christian culture. They sort of eschewed these ideas. But in the city-states of Europe, especially Florence, we think at the beginning the idea of taking many of these ideas and the excitement about Kabbalism and packaging them as humanism, and that's the idea that man is the measure of all things, and that man is responsible for his own destiny. And those ideas would sort of be housed and stored and transmitted in the East and the West through alchemy. And alchemy, simply put, we can think of it as humans engaged in their own evolution. But not a sort of willy-nilly evolution. It's a designed evolution with a particular outcome in mind. So we're going to think about what the outcome is, the eschatology of Hermeticism and Kabbalism and alchemy. Because alchemy is about combining and recombining. And as we see, these different schools of mystery thought are combining and recombining themselves in a way that will be most effective to reach this end game. And who are the people that are responsible for housing this information? We can call them the wise men, the magi, but it's really the elite, if you want to use that word, the oligarchical class. It's occulted knowledge, so it's something that is done in a way that it's knowledge given to those that are deserving of it, and through sets of initiation. And I think you're familiar with this concept. But we go from the Renaissance and this idea of humanism now that's going to be embedded into the university system as a certain kind of naturalism. So there's a severing with this tradition, at least for the common people. The goyim, if you like, the unwashed masses are going to kind of just receive this idea that knowledge is severed from the heavens and we're here on earth. And our job now through knowledge, gnosis, and what's going to become the modern alchemy or science is to sort of bring heaven down to earth. And that's sort of part of the job here of this left-hand path. And a fancy way of saying this is to immanentize the eschaton, the immanization, to make heaven come to earth. It's very different from the other path, which is we are asked in the biblical tradition to be obedient to God and work through his plan for our own, in biblical terms, salvation. In the term of the left-hand path, usually think about words, their own ascension, their own transcendence. And so we have these two paths differing from each other, but paralleling each other throughout history. One is a revealed exoteric plan, and the other is an occulted or esoteric plan. But they always work through human history in relation to one another, and always have. And once we see this going on in the world today, it's going to be, once you decide to put that in your head, and it's up for you to decide to put that into your head and have an understanding of these two traditions, it will be undeniable to you that the events, nearly all of them, are working through this relationship between these two paths, and both have their own sacred text with their own eschatology, and we're just working through the outlines of this right now to see the world through the designs of especially the people that have for so long occulted this knowledge, but now we're living in a time we call a biblical time of revelations. Things are being revealed, or a time of breaking open the knowledge base and having it available to everybody. So from the Renaissance, The next movement, I think, after modern science, which is really a repackaging of the alchemical agenda with the combination of the Kabbalah and Hermeticism, would be theosophy, which is an attempt to take all of these different worldviews from around the world that have been largely a product at one time or another of Hermeticism and Gnosticism, and to put them together in a more coherent plan. And that was a late 19th, early 20th century innovation. And it's now essentially what we call the New Age worldview. And if you'll go back to, a few of my lecture / short film presentations, there's this idea of Cornwallis telling Washington, we're essentially creating a corporation here, and part of this project, the esoteric plan, is, he would say, to bring the Jews' religion into your schools and churches. What he meant by that was to bring this Kabbalism and make it so pervasive through what we would call the New Age that it's just, we're like fish in water. It's so obvious that it's so in front of us, we don't even see that it has been there by design. So what is it, and why is it there, and how can we not separate it from another worldview? And that's what we said, that was the project at hand. So you couldn't even tell the difference between the two. So there's a project that you took the peanut butter to get to the jelly, but there was a sandwich being created here. And I'm going to continue here with my next piece of this by first, I want to read quickly here from this idea that deep state sorry for the interruption here. I'm going to just go, because we're going to cut to this. We're going to go with historian Karen Voss, who notes a broad agreement, and I'll put a footnote to this at the end, a broad agreement among scholars as to which currents of thought can be placed within a category of esotericism. And again, that's usually considered Western esotericism in scholarly study, ranging from ancient Gnosticism and Hermeticism through Rosicrucianism. Oh, I forgot those two brilliant things in between the Renaissance, modern science. Of course, at the same time, we get Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. That course is going to be definitely part of creating that economic infrastructure that will bring on the New Age and the New Age movement and the New Age thought. And so, in the 18th and 19th century, they would be put throughout the world, and not just the major cities, but into the smallest towns and hamlets throughout the land. And part of their function was to work the peanut butter and the jelly together for this, as they like to say, great work. Great alchemical work, great Kabbalistic work, great Hermetic work. And what is the great work? Well, we'll get into a little bit of the language of esotericism. But so Karen is going to say, ranging from Gnosticism, Hermeticism, through Rosicrucianism and Kabbalah, that it will be largely focused on the Hermetica. And again, I've mentioned before, and I'll mention again, Frances Yates is a wonderful scholar to go to this at all. She doesn't separate the concepts of Kabbalah and Hermeticism. She calls it the Hermetic Kabbalah. And I think that's a great way to think about it. But I'm going to finish off here with a text by Glenn Alexander McGee. And he is going to, and this is from a text called Hegel and the Hermetica. It's Cornell University Press, 2001. And again, Glenn Alexander McGee. And he's going to kind of combine these in a wonderful scholarship way and hit to the central tenets. And these tenets are things that are put out as an objective to move history in order for these events to come about. So that's what oligarchs do. They give you a window of history, whereas everything's accidental, and they, in fact, are manufacturing this peanut butter to get to the jelly. So we're going to talk about what's the jelly here that they're getting to. So I really wanted to introduce that text of Hegel and the Hermetica. And the reason Hegel is so important here, in the peanut butter side of it, the American Constitution, Federalist 10 had to create this ever evolving, this abstracted notion. Again, oligarchs like their usury, monopolies and corporations to get to their abstraction, a way of shaping perceptions to bring their plan together. And an important piece of this will be the world federalism that was the blueprint was laid out by Kant shortly after the German thinker, shortly after the Constitution of the United States in the very beginning of the 19th century. And his contemporary over in Germany was Hegel. And today we hear a lot about the Hegelian dialectic. He's kind of the grandfather of this new era of the New Age. And so Hegel is a hermeticist. He's a Kabbalistic hermeticist, like most of the great oligarchical sort of go-to position people. And so we're looking at Hegel and the Hermetica because whereas Kant is laying out the peanut butter of this, the political economic federation, Hegel is doing his esoteric piece, kind of controlling and perceptioning the thought and the management, but also laying out the esoteric agenda of the larger Hermetic Kabbalistic project. And so I'm going to continue with those central tenets of Hegel, but let me just finish here. If you haven't heard of the Hegelian dialectic and your mind is sort of trapped in one of the many isms or theories that we learn at school, which are largely created as mind traps, especially for the brighter of the students out there. The Hegelian dialectic has been, at least in this modern iteration of history, a way of moving history forward and controlling the perceptions of the masses. And oftentimes, I'd encourage you to go out there on the internet and look for the Hegelian dialectic, the right-left paradigm, because if you're still buying into it, it's hard to free yourself up and truly know the events that are unfolding in the world today. But Hegel came up with this idea: simply oligarchs control the left and they control you to the left, and it's a managed system. So whether you pick A or B, blue or red, it's still marching forward to their great work. And this is something that's difficult for people because people want to feel that there's something they can do in the world that's meaningful and that makes a difference. And I would say that for people that find this information, again, if this is new, if this is something you're forging through, there's going to be pain involved in this, even if you're kind of higher level or a little bit more awake. There's levels of pain because part of this is it's disempowering to feel, because we can go to school and have our ears tickled or go to oftentimes our religious institutions or Italian, there's always something you can kind of do. And where we're going with some of this information, it feels like whether you choose the left or the right or A or B, that they've all been managed and controlled. Okay. But the big moment of getting through the pain is this moment when you can see that the choice of owning your consciousness and how you think and perceived is no longer handed to you. And you can decide whether or not you want to partake in that peanut butter and jelly sandwich. That's a moment that's no longer disempowering. You've gone through the pain, and that's the radical liberation of awakening and moving from the cave and the images that these oligarchs have given to you and seeing the light of day. And it's the most important transition an individual who is created, I believe, to be free and independent of mind can do in this world. And part of that is breaking through a lot of the bread and circus that surrounds us. So I will continue here with many of the tenets given to us through Hegel and the Hermetica. And I hope you have enjoyed thus far the introduction here to the deep state esoterica or the esoteric deep state. Thank you.